if you're interested in renting a flat, I've got some prime real estate for you here. Just look at that, beautiful architecture, very nice. So welcome back to Everard Junction. It has been a number of weeks since the previous video, and the reasons for that should be pretty obvious. It has been one of the hottest summers I've certainly ever experienced in this country, and I've been out enjoying the weather. So with that said, I've had a nice summer and I'm looking forward to getting stuck into the layout as we move towards the autumn and the winter. As you can see in front of you, I have made a decent bit of progress despite the absence, and that's the focus of this video, with particular attention being paid to the station platforms. These have taken quite a while to put together, but I'm pleased with the results. They're certainly not finished, there's an awful lot left to do. You'll also note in the background I have installed the first of the replacement back scenes. Replacing the back scenes on the layout is something I've been talking about for the last few months, and as you can see, the first board is now in position. It's 8 foot long and it has significantly less joins in it than my previous attempt. So let's hand over to myself back in June when I started creating the platform edges. That's the brick that you can see on the sides of the platforms. So we'll start off with those and you'll see the whole process. We'll build all the platforms and then I'll go into a little bit more detail at the end about the building and the scenic break that you can see to the left. So the first thing I've done to get things going for the platform detailing is to cut some strips of plasticard. This is brick embossed plasticard, and I like to use the stuff that's made by Southeastern Finecast. They do quite a nice range of different bonds of various bricks in various scales. So I've cut some 19mm strips of that plasticard out, and I've just gone over that with just a spray can of primer, and then I've gone over the top of that with some brick enamel paint, and in this case I've used Humbrol number 70, which is a sort of nice shade for various bits of brickwork. So the next thing to do is to apply a mortar wash to this, and that will highlight all of the mortar course in the brickwork and make it look a lot more real. As you can see, it looks rather plain and generic as it sits now. I've shown it a few times on the channel before, but we'll show it again. Mortar washing brickwork, very straightforward, very simple. What I like to do is mix up a sort of mortar sort of colour. So this is a mix of various acrylic paints. I pour all of those into just a spare pot that I have here, and that's quite heavily thinned. And you'll see when I pour it out onto the brick how it sort of runs into the course. I'll use a large soft paintbrush to just spread that around, get good coverage, and then once it's dried we can wipe off the excess, and that will leave behind a nice bit of mortar washing into the brickwork, and then we can go over the top of that and give it some age and some weathering. So there you go, you can see that the paint is indeed quite thin, and how it's run into the mortar course there. Obviously there's still a light covering on the surface of the bricks, and once this is dried we'll sort that out. So next we'll take a series of cotton buds, soak those in some thinner. In this case I'm using acrylic thinner, as I've used acrylic paint for the washing. If you've used enamel for the wash, then obviously use enamel thinner. And we'll wipe the cotton buds down the brickwork like that and remove the excess paint from the surface of the bricks, which will leave behind a nice mortar course. And there you can see the difference between removing the excess paint and leaving it in situ. You can see how the wall looks a little bit more convincing. So it's quite a lengthy process. I'll go ahead and wash and remove the excess from all the other bits of plasticard that I've got cut up and prepared, and then we'll apply some weathering to that, make it look a little bit aged, a little bit abused. After all, it is a station platform, so it's going to get quite dirty over several years in service. And then we'll take all of that upstairs and we'll glue it into position onto the platform, and that will allow us to then start working on that top surface. So I've finished sorting all of those out. The next thing to do now is some weathering. You can see the two strips over here have been weathered with a little bit of weathering powder. Just used two basic colours and it just tones things down, makes things look, you know, several years old, gives it that sort of aged look. To achieve that, I've got these two weathering sets from Tamiya, set A and set B, very effective, and I'll be using the soot from set B and the mud from set A, and using those in combination seems to go quite nicely on the old red brickwork. So here we are back at the layout. I've glued the strips together into one long section, and we can now apply this to the platform. To glue the strips together, I'll take a very thin piece of plasticard, just use a bit of plastic glue to join the two sections together, and as you can see, if you butt them up nice and close, then you get a pretty good join. A little bit of extra weathering over that and it will completely disappear. So with that now cut to length, I shall use some rocket card glue to glue it to the plywood platform. I find the rocket card glue works quite well at holding the plasticard to the wood, seems to work a little bit better than the super glue. The base platform itself is two pieces of 9mm plywood screwed together to create an 18mm tall section. The plasticard itself is, I think, 18 or 19mm. Once it's glued into position, I will just run a knife along the top edge of it just to skim off any of the excess, and then we're ready to put that top surface down. I'll be gluing it in sections and working my way along the platform. It's a bit much to do it all in one go. Some sort of box that's got a nice square 90-degree shape to it and a few weights really helps just push that plasticard into the plywood while that rocket card glue dries, and we'll slowly work our way along the platform until that's all finished. I've left that platform edging overnight to fully dry. We can go ahead and start getting ready to put the paving slabs in. As you can see on these more completed platforms, we've got a nice run of paving slabs running down the edge of the platform as per the real thing. First thing I'm going to do is just trim off some of the plastic with a sharp knife. There's a couple of spots along the platform length here where it's just sitting a little bit higher than the top of the platform edge, and we want those paving slabs to sit nice and flat onto this wooden surface. So I'll just run along like so with a knife and just trim everything for a nice fit. The paving slabs that I'm using for this particular station are made by Juwela, which I believe is a German company. I've used several of their products over in the scrapyard. They make a lot of sort of cast ceramic components that are good for detailing and things like that. I got these from Model Scenery Supplies. There don't seem to be too many stores in the UK selling the Juwela stuff, but Model Scenery Supplies usually have a good stock, and I've used the paving slabs, the 132 scale ones, which are the 50 by 50. I've got a box of 270 of those, as obviously for this station I will need quite a lot. And there's the part number for those of you who are interested in getting some of these. As you can see, because these slabs are made of ceramic, each one is ever so slightly different in its appearance, and it creates quite a sort of authentic, sort of realistic look for the edge of the platform. Whenever you see any paving slabs, even if they're new, they're not all exactly the same colour, and certain ones will have stains and marks on them. It's worth bearing in mind that the slabs, because they're made of ceramic, are very brittle and easily damaged. However, I think this actually makes things look a little bit more authentic. When did you last walk along a station and find all of the slabs and all of the tarmac, if it's got tarmac on it, to be in perfect condition? I'll be positioning the slabs just over the edge of the platform to create a very slight overhang. As per the real thing, many station platforms you'll find are like this. Some platforms, especially older ones, might have an additional run of brick at the very top, a strip of sort of reinforcing brickwork up to the edge of those slabs, and it just depends on the prototype that you're modelling and what station you're using for inspiration. In this case I'm keeping it simple, and I'm just going for a single piece of overlap brick and the slabs, and I think that looks perfectly effective. But if you want to, there's certainly many examples of stations where the brickwork gets a little bit more complicated, a bit more ornate towards the top near the slabs. So I'm just going to start off at the far end of the platform and work my way all the way down the station to the fiddle yard. It does take quite a while, but just take your time with the steel rule and just make sure you keep everything straight and get a nice sort of 1mm, 2mm overhang on that paving slab, and it will look quite effective once it's done. On this particular platform I've decided to go for just an abrupt stop for the end of the platform. There are many stations up and down the country where this is very much the case, and I've also got the other platforms in the station sloping down gradually in the more traditional manner, so it just provides a little bit of variety and something else to look at when viewing the station. And for comparison, you can see the sloped, more traditional platform here. So I think that'll just make things look a little bit more interesting and just add a little something to the station. Of course, I've made sure adequate clearance is present for a slight overhang on the paving slabs. So I've just checked that with various items of rolling stock, positioned the steel rule in the right place, and you can see I've just placed a couple of weights on that as well, and that'll just stop that ruler from moving as I slowly install these paving slabs. The slabs have now dried, and now it's time to look at doing some of the tarmac that goes in the sort of main portion of the platform. Now there's loads of different surfaces for the top of a platform on the railways in the UK, anything from concrete to tarmac to slabs, and a mixture of all three. I've decided to go for the sort of poured tarmac sort of finish, as that was quite common in the western region that I'm modelling, and I think it goes quite nicely with the sort of slabs that we've got on the edge of the platforms. To create it, I'll be using grey tiling grout. You can get grout from pretty much any DIY store, and as you can see it's quite a sort of dark colour that I've got at the moment, and I'm half tempted to not paint it as it does look quite convincing on its own, but I will be adding painted effects in certain areas, and maybe even paint the whole thing in different shades and stuff to represent patches, bits that have been dug up, bits that have been relaid, as it does look rather uniform with everything being exactly the same colour. As you can see, you get a slightly rough surface once it's all finished drying. There is a certain process to installing it, which I'll of course show you shortly. But yeah, as you can see, it's got a bit of a rough texture to it. There's little bits of variation in there, and it's not a perfect surface, and that's exactly what I'm looking for. And as I was saying earlier, with regards to the cracked and damaged slabs, the slightly imperfect finish between the slabs all just lends itself to the authenticity of the scene, making things look like, you know, a used and abused imperfect station platform that's been in service for many years.
So in preparation for applying the grout, it is quite a messy process. So I've masked up the track and the slabs with just some cheap nasty masking tape, nothing too fancy. And I've also, on this particular platform, applied a very thin strip of card towards the rear, and that's just going to act as a little bit of a dam, stop the material falling off the edge of the platform there, and should just allow me to get a little bit more of a smooth surface when I start smoothing things out. Obviously on this platform over here I've got slabs on both sides, so it was a little bit easier in that case to apply the grouted finish. On this side just got to be a little bit more mindful of material going over the edge, and we should be okay. Obviously I've removed the back seam from the layout and put that to one side, as the last thing we want is to cover that with any glue or grout material. So I've put that to one side, and once this platform has been completed, then we'll reinstate the back seam. So the first thing to do is to apply some watered down PVA glue to the surface of the platform, and this will just give a nice base for the grout to stick to. And obviously, because everything is masked up, we don't have to worry too much about getting glue on stuff outside of this area. Now for the grout itself, I like to apply it from just one of these small containers. These come with Oxford die-cast vehicles. I always keep these, very useful for scatter material. So we'll just be quite generous and scatter a good amount of the grout onto the platform. I need to be quite generous as those paving slabs are about 1mm in height, so we do need to build up a little bit of material here. So on its own you can see that looks awful, but it's all part of the process. So the next thing to do is to soak that area down and then apply some watered down PVA glue to the whole surface, soak it all in. And then what we can do is use a straight edge and smooth the surface off. So we can run across the top of the grout with a flat surface, and that will create a nice smooth finish for us and fill in any of the sort of low areas. The high areas will get smoothed out, and we'll end up with a pretty good finishing point to leave to dry. And then we can come back once it has dried and just double check everything, apply some more grout if we think we need to, but if it's all good we can go ahead and give it a very light sanding. So I'll go ahead, soak this down with some water from a spray bottle, and then apply the PVA glue mix. And you can see the importance of masking up the paving slabs and the track work, as you don't really want to get any of this gooey sort of grey mix onto the track. So as you can see, the glue is soaking quite nicely into that grout. I'm going to leave it for a few more minutes, and then I'll go over it with a spreader, just a scrap piece of cardboard in my case, and just smooth the whole surface out, and then we'll leave that to dry overnight. So there you can see I've smoothed out the grout. A lengthy process, and it can be quite messy. I'm not looking for an absolutely perfect finish, as I've stated previously, because we are looking for some level of realism, and realism means not perfect. But hopefully you can see there it's a lot smoother. I'll leave that overnight to dry. It will almost certainly need a little bit of extra work in the morning, but we'll come back up and just see how it's done overnight, remove the masking tape, and just see where we're at. Okay, so it's now the following morning. This is now dried. It's nice and solid. So the next thing to do is to just go over it and touch in any of those imperfections. There's a few spots where the grout has sunk into the screws that hold the wood down, and there's a couple of little low spots and one or two little marks on it. So I'll go over it with some PVA glue with a paintbrush, apply a sort of thin scattering of the grout, and then just smooth that with a spreader once again, and that should get us a finish that looks a little bit more like this platform over here. And there we go, nice and smooth, and that's filled in any of the small cracks and imperfections that appeared in the first layer as it dried. So I'll leave this to cure for several hours, and then we'll come back, remove the masking tape. That's all of the grout now dry, and I've vacuumed off any excess material from that platform. You have the option at this point to give it a light sanding if you want to create a slightly smoother finish. It just depends, you know, what you're going for, what sort of effect you want, and what you want to do, really. I'm going to leave that for the time being. I think it looks all right. It's got that sort of slightly uneven surface, and it's certainly not perfect, which is exactly what I'm going for. So the next thing to do is to ballast the track between the two platforms here. I like to do the ballasting afterwards, because when you're moving the grout material around, as you probably noticed in the various video clips, it is quite a messy process, and if any of that material should fall onto the surface of the ballast, it can be a right pain to remove, and then you'll end up doing a bit of corrective work. So I like to do the ballasting afterwards, and it also means that this brickwork looks nice and set into the ballast there. It looks like the platform has a proper foundation. So as you can see, I've masked up this entire platform with just some rubbish cheap masking tape, nothing fancy, and I'll do the same on this platform over here, and then we'll go ahead and do the ballasting. Simple process, you've seen me do it about 100 times. 50-50 mix of PVA glue and water with a splash of dishwashing detergent. Put the ballast down loosely, move it around with a soft brush until it looks nice and how you want it and there's nothing getting in the way of the rails. Spray it down with some water so it's nice and wet, and then just pour on the glue mix and leave it for about 48 hours to dry. Okay, the ballast is now all spread into position. Try to make sure that the ballast is off the top of the sleepers. A little bit here and there doesn't matter, and if anything actually looks quite realistic, but the main thing you're looking for is to keep the ballast away from the inside edge of the rails, as that will make a nasty noise at best, or at worst cause derailments when the train runs over the track. I'll spray that down heavily with a dash of water from a spray bottle, and then I'll go over that with a 50-50 glue mix with a splash of dishwashing detergent in there as well. The dishwashing detergent just helps the glue soak into the ballast, and as today looks like it's going to be another particularly hot day, I expect temperatures up here will be getting on for 35 degrees Celsius, so with any luck this should dry in about 24 hours. So there we go, plenty of glue. Don't be afraid to put loads of glue onto the ballast. After all, you don't want it really going anywhere. And we'll leave that to dry. Hopefully, as I say, 24 hours or so, probably be dry. It's been very hot the last couple of weeks, so we'll see how that looks tomorrow. So it's been several days now, and this ballast is now rock solid, ready to be weathered. I've just run over it with the vacuum cleaner, just got rid of any loose little bits and pieces, and you can see the platforms are still masked up. As I've already weathered the brickwork that runs along the edge here, I don't really want to get too much more dirt on that. I'm quite happy with the appearance of those. So I've masked those up, and now we can use some rail match sleeper grime, in this case the enamel variety, to airbrush this track and make it look sort of nice and dirty, a little bit like what we have over here. While the ballast was drying, I did make sure just to check the points were still clear and still switched in either direction. If you're using insul frog points and you're relying on electrical conductivity between the two rails when you change from one direction to the other, make sure that's masked up, or at least give it a clean after you've finished doing the ballasting. As I'm using the newer Pico Unifrog type points, they are through wired and do not rely on a connection. It's all done underneath, so I can paint these, get these covered in glue, and it doesn't really affect their operation. But just be mindful if you've got these sort of older insul frog style points, or if you've got electro frog points and you haven't wired them up yet, you will need to make sure that these rails here are clean. When it comes to track weathering, there really is no right or wrong amount of track weathering to do. It's entirely up to you and what you want to do for the location on your layout. Track in the UK can be absolutely filthy, or it can be spotlessly clean, or somewhere in between. It just depends the time of year, how old the track is, what sort of environment it's kept in, how often it's used, things like that. So I'm going to be going for something a little bit similar to how I've done it over here, sort of a gentle sort of track weathering, and I'll run down the centre of the tracks, down between the two rails, with perhaps some roof dirt or some sort of jet black to create a little bit of oil spillage and leakage from the various locomotives. So I've mixed a 50-50 mix of paint to thinner in the airbrush, spraying on quite a low pressure, somewhere around 20 psi, and as I've said earlier, I'm using the enamel variety of the paint. I find the enamel's just a little bit more hard wearing, and it's a bit more resilient, which is very useful with regards to track weathering, as you know, I'm quite often cleaning the track, you know, every couple of months or so, and you know, vacuuming any dust or loose scatter materials as I continue to build the layout. This does get quite a lot of abuse, so the enamel paint seems to do a nice job of staying stuck. The acrylic looks just as good, but I find it is a lot easier to remove. I'll be focusing my attention on the new section, of course, but I'm also going to do a little bit of touch up on this area, as it's been a while since I weathered this section, and I've been doing an awful lot of work on the station area since then, and there are a couple of bits that have got damaged. So that's the track now weathered. I might come back and add a few more effects and bits and pieces, just some little smaller areas of detail and things like that, but the general weathering is done. You can see these two tracks, I've ended up making them a little bit heavier, a little bit dirtier than, say, these ones over here. And that's just to create a little bit of variation, and this side sees a lot of passenger trains that stop at the station, this side sees more freight and through trains, things like that. So I like to sort of do that, just, you know, a bit of variation. Not everywhere on a railway is going to have the same level of weathering, and you can see massive differences in just small areas of a few hundred meters. So I'll leave all that to dry. You can see there's a few loose stones and things that have blown about and sort of made themselves known. So once this is all dried, I'll vacuum off all the excess again, make sure everything is sorted, and then we'll remove the masking tape, exposing the platforms, and we can have a bit more of a better look at how this area is coming together. Then we'll move on to some painting effects and things for the platforms themselves, and then we can start looking at some of the surrounding scenery. It's now been several hours and the paint has dried, so I've removed all of the masking tape from the platforms and reinstated the back scene. So there's still quite a bit of painting left to do, various details for the platforms, and of course the usual white line that goes along the platform edge needs adding. But I'm going to take a break from painting for the moment. I'm going to focus on a little bit of the scenery that goes at the far end of the station. At the moment you can see it just sort of ends and goes into the fiddle yard, the storage area for the layout. So what I need to do is I need to create a scenic break and block all of this off, so you can't really see that the station is quite short and disappearing into a storage yard. So what I'll be doing is creating a piece of timber work that comes up to maybe somewhere around here, and that will form a little bit of a small town scene and also serve as an area to put things like a station building and stuff like that. So I've got a few plans in my head for how to do that, but putting quite a bit of thought into it, and I can also then start thinking about some of the scenery in the foreground, this section here. But for the moment the priority is going to be creating that illusion that the station goes underneath a road bridge of some description with a bit of a sort of town like feel. Much of the general layout of the station area is coming from Ealing Broadway. That's a station on the outskirts of London, and basically at Ealing Broadway what you have is a road bridge in a similar location here, the platforms in a sort of similar arrangement, with a large sort of office building, office monstrosity in the background there, and that will really sort of frame this corner off nicely and hide the fiddle yard perfectly. So I'm going to be using a lot of inspiration from Ealing Broadway and also other stations like Swindon. Further down the station, of course, there'll be things like footbridges and stuff like that, so you can get from one platform to another, and all of the associated platform details, you know, with regards to things like seating, waiting rooms, signage, and all that kind of stuff. But there's a long way to go before we reach that stage, but hopefully you sort of get a general idea now for the rough layout of the station side of this layout. So I'll go and cut a nice piece of plywood that we can put over this section here, and that will serve as our road bridge / street scene, and then the trains will disappear underneath it and you won't be able to see the fiddle yard. So I've managed to rustle up a couple of bits of plywood from the shed and just made something that will form the basis for the sort of town scenery that I'm planning on doing over here. So let's just pop that into place and see how things look.
So as you can see, we've got a nice flat top there that will form the basis for putting a few buildings up there and a small street. And I've just sort of made a couple of walls and bits and pieces, so it looks as though, you know, passengers can actually, you know, continue down the station. The station does go on for longer than it appears, and it all just adds to that illusion that the layout's bigger than it really is. Added a little piece of 9mm plywood here. I think that'll work as quite a nice sort of concrete lintel. You know, obviously once that's all covered in plasticard and weathered up, should look quite good. We've gone for a reasonably close gap to the roof of the rolling stock, as you can see there. There's probably about 10mm, maybe 12mm between the roof of the coach and the structure, and that seems to be certainly quite close to the sort of various urban areas that I've been looking at for inspiration. In this area here, I'll be adding some form of a car park, multi-storey sort of thing, and again, it just sort of lends itself to the urban environment, creates some more sort of shapes and levels and things to look at in here. I'm hoping to have lots of different elevations. It should look quite good. Large building in the background over on the far platform, which will also form the basis for the station building, and then buildings across here as well, and it should all sort of box things in. And as you can see, certainly from where the camera is at the moment, you can't see the fiddle yard, and it looks like things go on for longer than they really do. It helps sell the illusion. I've made a start on one of the buildings, so let's get that into place, and it will just help further illustrate what I'm trying to do. So as you can see, the first building is very much underway. This is a scratch-built item. Again, I've used my Cricut Maker to help speed the process up. No way was I going to cut all those windows out by hand. Those of you familiar at all with Ealing Broadway might recognise this structure. I am loosely basing it off the real shops that are on the overbridge across the road from the station. If you go around the back of those, they look a little bit like this, where you've got what I presume are sort of flats, and then underneath on the ground floor you've got this sort of interesting sort of alleyway that runs through the back of the buildings, with there being a sheer drop to the railway line just behind. And then in real life, if you travel a little bit further down the line, there's then another bridge that then turns into a very large multi-storey car park. Behind the buildings, up here on the top deck, you can see there's quite a lot of space. This will be a street with pavements either side, and I will see what I can do about the back scene and try and avoid the road terminating in clouds, as that will look a little bit strange. But we'll be having a road with pavement either side, and then I'll be putting some similar buildings to these ones, different style of architecture, maybe a little bit taller, a little bit shorter, not exactly sure, and it's going to be more shops. So the idea being that it's sort of a little bit of a bustling high street, and have lots of figures and street lighting and things like that, and it should look quite nice in its own little scene. And then when you pan to the right and look over the edge of the building, suddenly you've got this huge railway station with trains running through. So almost a little diorama within the layout itself. So I'm looking forward to getting creative up here. And as you can see on this side of the building, I've made a decent start on the shops. And those of you familiar with the area in real life may now recognise it a little bit more clearly with the architecture and the style of windows on the front of the building. So if you stand in front of Ealing Broadway Station and look across the street, looking at those shops, this is roughly what the building sort of looks like. I've done my best to try and create a sort of period correct range of shops that you might have seen in 1989. I wasn't around in the 80s, so researching these proved a little bit difficult and took quite a bit of time. I started off at work, asked a few of the guys who were, shall we say, of a certain age, said, guys, you know, what shops do you remember going to in the 1980s, what was popular, what was around, and here's a selection of some of those suggestions. Finding all the logos proved quite difficult, but I got there in the end. These are still very much a work in progress, lots of painting and extra details to add, but at the end you can see we've got Workers' Cafe, which is just a sort of generic, independent little sort of cafe that were very typical during the 1980s. That then moves to Dewhurst, which was a chain of butchers that was popular during the time period. Happy Shopper, which was a chain of newsagents, I'm told, that sold various products of dubious quality. You got the old Ladbrokes there with the older logo. Super Snaps, where you used to go and take your film and get your photographs developed, if any of you can remember doing that. WH Smith and the old logo with the brown and orange. Then we've got Boots the Chemist, quite often saw those in very small little shops and locations, sometimes even in railway station concourse sort of areas. So I thought that would do the job. Then we got a classic one, radio rentals. You used to rent electrical equipment before they became so cheap. Everybody just started buying TVs and stuff like that. But back in the day, they cost a fortune. You used to go and rent them. And then finally, we've got R Price Records, which was a popular record chain during the 80s and 90s. As you can see, I've doctored the logo slightly there and made a few changes just to make it a little bit more appropriate for this layout. This is just a small row of shops on the layout. There will be other rows of shops and other bits of retail appearing in various other places over hopefully the next year or so, and I'll be building some more shops as well across the road from these ones. So some other classic logos and companies that everyone's forgotten about will be making an appearance just to give it that 80s feel. As you can see, since the last clip, I've made a bit more progress on the building. We've got the beginnings of the roof starting to look a little bit more professional, and I'm also adding various cassettes to the inside of each cell of buildings. So there's a cardboard cassette running through each building with various floors to separate everything out. That will serve as a nice mounting point for lighting in the future, and it's also allowing me to fit windows, blinds and curtains. Looking at the real building in Ealing Broadway, it's apparent that the roof has a sort of felt-like structure with long strips of roofing felt affixed to the building. So that's what I've done here. These are thin strips of plasticard, and so far I've just given them a quick coat of primer. Obviously needs a lot more weathering and extra detail adding to it. Some curtains and blinds also bring the building to life, and that's about as far as I'll go with the interior detail. You can see that the blinds are all quite different, and some of them are at jaunty angles, just like real blinds in real life. Those are made by Scale Model Scenery, and they're very effective. The curtains are just made from coloured card, and I just cut something out and glue it into position. I'll slowly work my way around the rest of the building as I continue with the construction. I've also added some white line detail to the platforms, or at least started to. We'll cover that in more detail in the next video, and you can also see that the timber work that forms this scenic break has had some concrete and some brick plasticard applied to it, just to give it a little bit more realism and authenticity. It's not finished yet, of course, but I'm quite happy with the result. So I'm going to leave it there for this video. That seems like a logical place to stop. In the next one, we'll carry on with the station detail and building up the various structures. We'll cover the scratch building in a little bit more detail. I'll show you the cricket maker in a little bit more detail, and we'll sort of go through the process for starting to construct the main station and office building that goes above it. But for now, I'll leave it there. I hope you enjoyed it, and as always, I'll see you on the next one as soon as I've made enough progress.